Mel Brooks, a comedy icon with more than 7 decades shaking Hollywood with unrelenting laughter, the man who turned the unspeakable into jokes, who dared to mock the most terrifying symbols of history, and who redefined the boundaries of artistic freedom, from the boldness of the producers to the sharp satires of Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. He conquered audiences not with safety, but with wit, recklessness, and a strange ability, making the world laugh at the very things that scared them. Millions see him as a genius, a fearless storyteller, a symbol of intelligence and rebellion. But behind those bursts of laughter is a story that is not light, but quietly painful. A childhood that began with loss when his father passed away too soon. A child who grew up in poverty, learning how to survive in a world that was never gentle. The war years witnessed the absurdity of death. The long days of rejection in an industry that did not see him. A broken marriage before he could understand what family meant. And then the greatest love of his life, Anne Bancroft. The only one who saw the real person behind the laughter, also passed away, leaving a void that no laughter could fill. And now at 99, when the pace of life has slowed and the stage lights are no longer as bright as before, a question begins to emerge more clearly than ever. What is really happening behind Mel Brooks's smile, in the silences that no one hears, in the memories that have never rested? Could it be that the laughter he brought to the world was never just joy, but a way to hide something deeper, darker, and more persistent? Because sometimes the people who make the whole world laugh are the ones who best understand the feeling of silence. And as he stands at the end of a long life's journey, Mel Brooks seems to be facing a truth that he has spent his entire life avoiding. He is not afraid of being misunderstood. He is not afraid of criticism. What he fears most, always, is that one day the laughter will disappear, and with it, he himself will gradually be forgotten. If the story behind Mel Brooks's laughter makes you think, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next part, where we will delve deeper into the losses that shaped his entire life. Mel Brooks was born in a poor Brooklyn, where the cramped houses, streets full of smoke and dust, and the laughter of children seemed silenced by the sighs of adults. His father, who should have been the first role model in life, left this world when Mel was only 2 years old, leaving the child with a void that memories could not fill. No teachings, no guiding hand, only a silent but profound absence, a kind of loss that a child did not know how to express. His mother, a strong but lonely woman, had to shoulder the burden of raising 4 children in impoverished conditions, her hands calloused from labor, her voice tired but still trying to comfort, still fulfilling the role of both father and mother. The cramped house lacked not only material things, but also emotional security. On cold Brooklyn winter nights, Mel would often wake up in the tense silence of a family missing a man, and wonder if anyone truly saw him. Without a father figure, he grew up in a world where every step had to be discovered on his own, every decision had to be taken responsibility for by himself, and every fear, whether it was the fear of abandonment, of being forgotten, or of failure, became heavier than usual. From those days, a quiet but persistent loneliness began to sink deep into Mel's soul, forming a spiritual armor where laughter would later become the only weapon to fight against a world full of uncertainty and silence. He learned to observe, to recognize half-hearted affections, to comfort himself when there was no hand left to lean on. Every smile of his later, whether on stage or in front of the camera, carried a reminder that behind the humor, there was always a child who had once been afraid, once lonely, once clearly felt the void of the love that should have been there. Poor Brooklyn not only taught him how to make a living, but also taught him how to exist inside losses. In the smell of smoke and dust, the sound of vehicles, and the long nights with no one to protect him, Mel learned that life sometimes is just finding a place to laugh, a place to be seen, a place where loneliness cannot erode the entire person. Those days of deprivation, lack of safety, lack of a hand to hold, created in him an invisible but persistent fear. The fear of abandonment, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that at any moment when the world did not see him, he himself would disappear from the map of love and care. And it was that fear from the first stumbling steps of life that formed Mel Brooks the man who would later make the whole world laugh. But every laugh contained a part of the pain that no one had ever seen. Every smile was an armor to protect the child inside from loneliness. And every role, every joke, every satirical line stemmed from the quiet but heavy loneliness that he had learned to live with since childhood. His mother's cramped house, the smell of soap, the smell of toasted bread, the sound of the old hairdryer from the beauty salon where she worked, all were deeply imprinted in Mel's memories as silent witnesses to a childhood of absence, teaching him that life never gives anyone everything, and that he had to create laughter himself to survive, to exist, and to never disappear into the darkness of the silence that had swallowed his childhood. All those losses, all those deprivations, became fertile ground for humorous imagination, bold creativity, and the ability to mock anything that others feared, factors that would help Mel Brooks not only survive, but also become a legend that the world will forever remember. Mel Brooks grew up on the narrow streets of Brooklyn, where every step had to weave through run-down buildings and shabby apartments. The laughter of children rang out mixed with the noise of the city. But for Mel, it seemed no one really paid attention to that little boy. He did not stand out, had no clear talent like the other kids in the neighborhood, had nothing that made others admire or notice him. And gradually, that very indifference sank deep into his soul, creating the feeling that he could disappear without anyone realizing it. In those years of hardship, every meager meal, every time he had to wear old clothes, every night hearing the cold wind blowing through the cracks in the door, he clearly felt that life had no place for children like him. Little Mel lived in a world where society seemed to have forgotten his existence, where being overlooked was more common than being criticized or beaten. The glances that swept past him in school, the bland words from neighbors, even close relatives sometimes did not really care, all combined to make him understand that invisibility was a part of himself that could not be separated. That if one day he disappeared, the world would hardly notice. He learned to exist quietly on his own, without begging for attention, without demanding love, only silently finding comfort in small things. A joke overheard from neighbors, a hastily written script on old paper, or just the image of his mother working hard in the beauty salon, striving to make sure her children did not go hungry. This feeling of invisibility was not a sharp pain, but a quiet pain that seeped in day by day, making Mel develop a subtle instinct for observation, learning to read people, read the world, and read himself. He began to realize that not standing out also had its own power. It allowed him to observe without being detected, allowed him to learn, allowed his imagination to develop naturally in the space that others left behind. But at the same time, it also planted in him a silent fear that no one could teach. The fear that he would really disappear. The fear that life would pass without anyone seeing his efforts, his emotions, his private thoughts. This feeling became a quiet driving force for the later Mel Brooks. He had to do something to be remembered, to prove that even if small, even if overlooked, he could still leave a mark. But all those early years were still a delicate combination of poverty, being looked down upon, and loneliness, where being overlooked was even more frequent than being attacked, creating an invisible but strong armor, teaching him how to endure, how to observe, and how to turn loneliness into strength. On those long nights in the shabby apartment, Mel imagined plays that had never been performed, stories that had never been told, characters that no one knew. All were ways he created his own world, where he had the right to exist and be seen, even if only in his imagination. And it was in that imaginary world that Mel Brooks began to form his extraordinary creative ability. The ability to turn pain into laughter. The ability to make people pay attention by making them laugh at what they usually feared. But even so, the feeling of disappearing without anyone noticing still haunted him like a ghost, reminding him that every laugh, every joke, every step on the future stage was not just for entertainment, but also to prove his own existence in a world that had once forgotten the little boy left behind in Brooklyn, where Mel Brooks first learned that sometimes surviving is not a victory, but how to be seen even once, so as not to completely disappear in the silence of life. All those things, poverty, being overlooked, quiet loneliness, created the foundation for the later person he became, a comedy legend. A man who made the whole world laugh, but inside, there was still a part of that little boy, still afraid of being forgotten. And it was that very fear that guided him on a path no one expected, a path both tragic and grand, where laughter was the weapon for survival and the proof of the survival of a child once overlooked by society. Mel Brooks soon realized that a smile could become the most powerful weapon in a world that showed no mercy. When he was still the overlooked boy in Brooklyn, he began to joke, tell funny stories, imitate voices, create characters and situations that made those around him burst out laughing, not only for entertainment, but to protect himself from contempt, indifference, and cold glances. The first time he witnessed real smiles from the crowd was an unforgettable moment. He was telling stories to the neighborhood kids, and the laughter rang out, making his heart beat fast, as if his whole body realized he existed, no longer invisible. From that moment, Mel Brooks understood that laughter was not just joy, but a way to connect, to be recognized, to exist in a world where attention was too rare. Every time he told a story, every time he created a funny character, it became a layer of protection, an invisible shield guarding the little boy inside from hurt. Small jokes, humorous gestures, gradually became something Mel carried in every situation, like a survival mechanism. He realized that if he could make others laugh, then the loneliness and feeling of abandonment would hurt less. If he could make them burst out laughing, he would be less touched by the indifference of the world. The way the audience laughed when he teased himself, imitated those around him, or built ridiculous situations, helped him understand that a smile could be a shield to protect the soul, and every laugh he created was at the same time proof of his own existence. Mel Brooks' early years, spent in poverty and loneliness, made him gradually develop a subtle ability to observe. He knew when to joke, knew when to stay silent, knew when he needed to turn pain into comedy, and when to just keep it in his heart. Joking became a way to learn, a means for him to experiment, to test others' reactions, and to build the ability to connect through laughter. When he stepped out of those old Brooklyn streets, stepped onto small stages, or stood in front of the first camera, he carried all that experience with him. All the smiles the little boy had ever heard, all the bursts of laughter he had ever created just to be seen, to not completely disappear. Laughter became the guiding star in his life, an indispensable weapon that helped Mel Brooks face a world full of pressure, with uncaring eyes, with people who could hurt with silence or words. And he realized that every skill, every joke, every humorous gesture was not pure talent, but the way he survived, the means to preserve life for the soul of the little boy once left behind. It was precisely because of that Mel Brooks was able to stand firm in the challenging years that followed, step onto the big screen, create classic comedies that the whole world would remember, and still always keep the sensitive heart of a child, where laughter was the only thing that seemed able to resist cruelty, loneliness, and wordless losses. Every line, every witty remark, every quirky character he created carried a part of that boy from back then. The boy who was always afraid of being forgotten, always afraid of disappearing in silence. And now, Every laugh he created on stage or in films was proof that that little boy still existed, still fought, and still won in his own way. Through the joy he gave to the world while at the same time saving himself from the darkness of abandonment and being forgotten. Mel Brooks, right from his teenage years, had learned that a smile was not just joy but also a shield for survival, but no one could prepare him for what happened when he stepped into World War II. As a young man, Mel joined the army, went through days close to death where bombs exploded, guns fired, and blood along with suffering existed around him every day, making him realize that the cruelty and absurdity of humanity did not only exist in imagination, but was happening right before his eyes. He witnessed comrades being knocked out of the battle line, lives ending in the blink of an eye, cruel decisions made by those in power, and the feeling of helplessness, of not being in control of anything, made him deeply understand that the world was not fair, not logical, and fear was not just a passing feeling, but became an instinct for survival. The battles, the screams, the tragic scenes made Mel see through the raw nature of life and realize that humor, the thing he had once used to protect himself in poverty and being overlooked, would now become a necessary mental tool to face the unbearable. Every detail in military life, from the freezing nights in the tent when he heard his comrades breathing heavily next to the body of someone who had just died, to the exhausting days trudging through the streets full of rubble and bombed-out cities, all etched into his mind, fears that no skill could erase, and at the same time nurtured his sharp observational ability, helping him recognize the absurdity, the humor hidden in tragedy, something that later became golden material for his satirical comedies. In those moments, Mel learned that laughing at scary things was not to make them lighter, but to hold himself steady, to prove that he still existed in a world where death, injustice, and cruelty were always present. Those experiences did not make fear disappear. On the contrary, it became clearer, more persistent, and dominated all his later actions, from the way he built characters to choosing scripts, acting, and screenwriting. Every time Mel Brooks created an absurd situation, a funny story that people thought was only for entertainment, it actually had roots in the awareness that the world was not fair and the fear of existence around people was something unavoidable. From the first laughs with children in Brooklyn, through small roles in television, then to films satirizing politics and history, Mel's comedy carried a sharp color, mocking fear, and always subtly reflected the absurdity he had witnessed in the war. He used humor to turn horrific things into games, fears into situations where the audience laughed while recognizing the injustice of life, so that he himself, when standing on stage or in front of the camera, felt that fear no longer controlled him. Even many years later, when looking back at the war days, Mel understood that those experiences taught him not only about death, about human cruelty, but also about how to survive with intelligence, with observation, and by turning fear into a source of creativity. It was from there that the famous satirical comedies later, from The Producers to Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, or Spaceballs, all bore the mark of him having faced the horror, mocked it, turned it into laughter, and at the same time held himself steady. Fear never disappeared, but he learned to laugh at it, turn it into a survival tool, and into material that made classic humorous moments, making the whole world laugh while realizing that beneath that humorous shell there always existed a person who had once faced the most intense darkness that any young man could imagine. And thanks to that, Mel Brooks not only survived, but also became a living legend of American comedy. Mel Brooks returned to New York after the war years, carrying empty hands and a heart full of longing to exist in a world that had always turned its back on him. The big, noisy, and cruel city seemed to swallow every effort of a fragile young man, where every opportunity closed before his eyes. Mel took on a series of odd jobs, sweeping hallways, delivering newspapers, carrying things in warehouses, waiting tables, doing everything to earn every penny. But no job lasted. No job brought a sense of belonging. Each passing day was a continuous chain of rejections, from auditions that were overlooked to letters that never received replies. It seemed New York never remembered his name, never recorded his efforts, or saw the silent presence of a person struggling to survive. Loneliness spread, helplessness piled up, and every time he walked through crowded streets where no one saw him, he clearly felt the feeling of invisibility, a pain unlike ordinary failure, but the pain of feeling that he existed while the world did not recognize it, that every effort was meaningless in the eyes of society. Each meal was just a slice of bread, a glass of water, long nights lying on the floor of a rented room. He told himself he had to continue, had to exist at any cost, one way or another, because not being seen was even more cruel than any rejection. In those moments, Mel Brooks began to nurture his ability to observe and his imagination. He learned to observe every detail around him, to read human emotions, and realized that if he could make at least one person laugh, at least one person recognize his existence, then that was already a victory. Laughter, right from this stage, became a mental weapon, he joked, created quirky characters, told stories, and experimented with every way to find attention, even if only fleeting. Every smile he received, no matter how small, was like a light illuminating the emptiness he felt in his heart, reminding him that a person's existence was not measured only by success or failure, but by being seen and acknowledged. Even in a short moment, those months full of loneliness and being overlooked, although without glory, without large audiences, taught Mel Brooks that existing in an indifferent world was the real challenge. The pain was not being rejected in a role or a small job, but when the feeling that no one recognized his presence weighed on his soul. And from those very experiences, he built the ability to turn suffering into creativity, turn helplessness into laughter, and turn every silent failure into material for the plays and films later that the whole world would remember forever. Every step in the city of New York, every footstep on the wooden floor, every indifferent glance sweeping past, all imprinted deeply into Mel Brooks' lessons about perseverance, about how to survive in the darkness, about having to create laughter for himself first before bringing it to the world. And it was precisely the being overlooked, the loneliness, and the hopeless efforts that forged the person he became, a comedy legend, an artist capable of turning his own quiet pain into a mental weapon that made the whole world laugh while feeling the truth of life. Mel Brooks finally found a way out of those days of loneliness and being forgotten when he stepped into the world of television, where the cramped studios, flashing lights, and cold cameras seemed not meant for a poor Brooklyn kid. Mel began trying his hand at scriptwriting and supporting roles in small shows, working tirelessly from early morning until late at night, learning to grasp the rhythm of the stage while learning to observe the audience's reactions, detail by detail. Then one day, that moment arrived. In a test shoot, he told a small story, a seemingly harmless bit of humor, and for the first time heard real laughter ring out from the audience below. That sound was not just a burst of laughter, it was proof that he was existing, that he was being seen, that the boy once forgotten by Brooklyn had finally found a place, however small, in this vast world, not because the role was highly rated or someone clapped and praised him, but because of the basic feeling, the core feeling of a human being, having his presence confirmed. That laughter seeped into every fiber of his being, into every heartbeat, making Mel realize that he not only existed, but also had value, at least to those witnessing that moment. From this first moment, he began to understand that laughter would not only be entertainment, but would be the reason to keep living, a source of mental strength that he had never known before. Every line, every gesture, every character he built on stage was measured by the audience's reaction, and the laughter rang out like a guiding light in the darkness. It reminded him that he existed, that he mattered, and that every effort, every failure, every lonely night before had meaning. Mel began to learn how to control this power, how to pull the audience into the story, to turn fear, insecurity, and the feeling of being forgotten into a shared experience where everyone could laugh together, while helping him feel seen for the first time in his life. Laughter became his second survival mechanism. It shielded him from the feeling of invisibility. It helped him move forward through days of failure and rejection. It made him believe that he could find a place in the world, that he was not completely invisible, that he deserved to exist. Every moment, every burst of laughter, every eye turned toward him served as a reminder that his efforts were not in vain, that the boy once forgotten in Brooklyn had now found his voice, found his own mental power, and that every smile the audience gave him was not only a reward but also a reason to keep walking, to keep creating laughter for the world, to affirm that he was alive, and that, no matter if the world turned its back, no matter if someone forgot, he still existed through every burst of laughter from the crowd, every laugh awakening belief in his own worth and the right to be present in this vast world. It was in that very moment that Mel Brooks understood that humor was not just a talent or a profession, but a means to live, the only way to prove to himself and to the world that he could not be overlooked, that he could not be erased from the memory of those who witnessed. And that laughter, those first bursts of laughter ringing out in a small studio from a small audience, was exactly the light illuminating the path he would walk for the rest of his life. Mel Brooks began to be seen, to be recognized, and gradually built his name in the television world as the shows he participated in received attention, even though at that time they were still only small roles and experimental scripts. But step by step, he could taste the flavor of success, the laughter from the audience. The temporary praises from colleagues and producers gradually transformed Mel from an invisible Brooklyn kid into a name that people started to remember. But with each step forward, the insecurity inside him did not decrease at all, but instead grew quietly, like an inescapable shadow. Every time Mel wrote a line, built a humorous situation, or stepped onto the stage, he felt the heavy pressure that if he missed the role, if the audience did not laugh, all the efforts from the days of loneliness and abandonment would disappear. The laughter he created was not only a reward but also proof of his own existence, of the right to be present in the world. Even of the public began to recognize his talent and the charm in the way he joked. Mel still frequently felt like he was standing on a tightrope over an abyss, where any mistake could make him fall into the chasm of oblivion, where every audience smile became a commitment he had to maintain, a responsibility he could not ignore. Success came to him like a gentle breeze blowing into his life, but fear and insecurity still clung tightly, reminding him that external recognition could not soothe the wounds that had sunk deep from childhood, that even when the audience clapped, his heart still beat fast with anxiety, because he knew that silence was only one step away, and everything could be erased in the blink of an eye. The pressure to make others laugh, to maintain the image of excellent humor, became the weight Mel had to carry every day. The long hours writing scripts, rehearsing characters, continuous auditions, or editing lines were not just work, but a matter of survival, a way to protect himself from loneliness and invisibility. In every step, every performance, every joke, Mel began to realize that success did not heal insecurity, that laughter from the audience could not replace the feeling of being seen, accepted, and loved by people who truly mattered. It only temporarily soothed, but could never completely fill the void that had formed since he was a boy in Brooklyn. Every burst of laughter on stage, every round of applause, every audience eye following him felt like a reminder that fame could not replace inner security, that career and reputation could not heal the pain accumulated from many years of absence, poverty, and being overlooked. And it was precisely this awareness that drove Mel Brooks to keep creating, to keep experimenting, to keep stepping onto the stage to tell stories, build characters, create new humorous situations, because he understood that if he stopped, fear would take over, the void would expand, and the invisibility he had once experienced would return, stronger than ever. Success brought him external light, but insecurity remained the inner darkness, the driving force that made him throw himself into every role, every play, every film, turning every humorous moment not only into entertainment, but also into a survival weapon, into the way he proved that he existed, that the audience's laughter was proof of his presence and worth. But at the same time, it was also a reminder that success could never erase the quiet wounds from childhood, that humor was not just talent, but a survival mechanism, a way to face a harsh world that he knew well, and that to step out of Brooklyn every day, to step out of the darkness, Mel Brooks still had to rely on laughter to know that he had not been completely forgotten, that he still had the right to exist, and that external recognition, no matter how warm, could not replace the feeling of being seen and surviving in his own heart. Mel Brooks reached a real turning point in his career when he decided to create his ambitious first film, The Producers, a work that, from the very idea, was shocking. A musical about Hitler staged to deliberately fail on stage, a topic that most people considered taboo, dangerous, and untouchable, but Mel did not see it as a barrier. He saw it as an opportunity to challenge himself, to control the fear that had been with him since childhood, and to prove that laughter could mock power without losing its own strength. During the making, he faced intense criticism from critics, from audiences afraid of the sensitivity, to colleagues who were surprised and skeptical about this crazy decision. Every time he heard the objections, the doubtful eyes, or the satirical articles aimed at his idea, Mel clearly felt the repeating fear he had once known, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of failure, the fear that the whole world would turn its back and the laughter he created would disappear. But he did not stop. Instead, Mel used comedy itself to face that fear, turning it into motivation to move forward, turning danger into experiment, turning the taboo into a mental weapon. The process of making The Producers stretched over many months. He wrote, acted, directed, and coordinated all at once, and every day was a battle with his own worries and personal limits. When the film was released, the initial reaction was chaos. Those not used to Mel's boldness condemned it. Others misunderstood the intention, and a few audiences were so shocked they dared not continue watching. But in Mel's mind, that was not failure. It was a sign that he was touching what he had feared all his life, and at the same time needed to conquer. The comedy in The Producers was no longer simply entertainment, but became a mechanism to control fear. By laughing at the scariest thing, Mel felt he was no longer controlled by it. Every shot, every line parodying power, every humorous melody carried a double meaning, both making the audience burst out laughing and reminding Mel that he still controlled his own fear, that the shadows from childhood, from war, from loneliness, could no longer dominate him. Throughout the filmmaking process, he learned to look fear in the eye, turn it into inspiration, turn the most terrible things in history and life into games, into art, and into mental strength. When The Producers was screened, the laughter from the audience was not just a reaction to the jokes, but also proof of inner victory. He had mocked the frightening to no longer be controlled by it. He had turned fear into an ally, and he had stepped over the threshold of fear that most people dared not touch. The success, the controversy, and even the criticism all became part of the survival lesson that Mel Brooks carried throughout his life. That if you can laugh at power, laugh at the most terrible thing, and keep yourself steady amid all the pressure, then you are no longer a victim of fear, but the one standing on the stage of your own life, directing both laughter and horror in harmony, turning quiet pain and simmering fears from childhood into material for survival and for creating an immortal comedy legend. Mel Brooks continued to reach the peak when he brought out iconic works like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. Films that not only made audiences laugh until they fell over, but also redefined the genre of parodying history and culture. Audiences across America began to recognize his outstanding talent, from the way he broke traditional norms, mocked power, to the way he turned taboos into timeless, humorous moments. Mel Brooks at this time was considered a comedy genius, a person capable of making the whole world burst out laughing at things that seemed serious and untouchable. But in his heart, the old fear had never disappeared. The first time audiences laughed at his jokes was so he could exist, and now the resounding laughter of the whole nation only made him more clearly aware of the secret fear, the fear of no longer being funny, the fear that one day the bursts of laughter would fall silent, and with that he would lose the mental power that laughter brought. Every shot, every line, every meticulously polished scene was not just for entertainment. It was the way he controlled fear and protected himself from quiet wounds, protected the boy once overlooked in Brooklyn from the feeling of being forgotten. The pressure to maintain the image became an invisible burden. He had to always appear as the humorous one, always create situations that made audiences laugh, because he knew that if at any moment the laughter did not ring out, the fear and insecurity from childhood would rush back like a wild wave. The more loved by audiences, the more the whole country laughed along with his witty jokes. Mel clearly felt the fear of losing control of himself, the fear that the mental power of laughter would be stolen, and he had to stay vigilant with his own ability to create joy. Even though success at this time was recognition of his hard work, proof of superior talent, for Mel it did not heal the deep wounds inside, did not erase the feeling that at any time he could return to the state of being forgotten, being invisible. It was precisely this fear that made every film scene, every script he wrote, every humorous segment he built have to be soaked with subtlety, care, and strength to protect himself. That was why his classic comedy films were always both funny and sharp, and carried a message about mental strength, about facing fear without being dominated by it. Mel Brooks understood that the more loved and applauded by audiences, the greater the fear of loss, the more persistent the worry of being forgotten. And his very awareness created the depth for every joke, every line, every scene he built. The audience's laughter now was not only a reward, but also a test for him to check whether he still held the power, still held control over fear, and still existed as a real person in the vast world full of pressure and expectations. Through these peak years, Mel Brooks was both a recognized genius and a person quietly fighting his own fear. And every burst of laughter from the audience not only made the world laugh, but also reminded him that the fear of existence never disappeared, that the pressure to maintain the image would follow him for life, and that even when the whole world laughed with him, there was still a part of the boy from Brooklyn who saw invisibility in the world, reminding him that laughter had to be the shield to protect himself from the darkness that no one could see. Mel Brooks met Bancroft in the years when he was gradually becoming famous in the entertainment world, and right from the first time, she saw through the real person behind the mask of humor that Mel had worn for so many years. While the whole world looked at him and saw only witty jokes, quirky characters, and non-stop laughter, Anne saw the boy who had once been lonely in Brooklyn, saw the quiet fears, the voids that success and laughter could not fill. She did not love the legend, did not love the laughter he brought to audiences, but loved the very person standing behind it, a man who knew fear, knew loneliness, but still dared to turn pain into art and joy for others. Their relationship formed on deep respect and mutual understanding. Mel could pour out everything without performing, without building an image, without having to joke to protect himself. And Anne was still there, accepting and loving him with all the exposed truth. For the first time in his life, Mel realized that he could be himself without fear of rejection, that he did not need to use laughter as a shield to exist when beside someone who understood him, and that opened up a moment of safety and peace that had never existed before. Anne's love became the only refuge in his life, A place where Mel could relax, cry, laugh, fail, or simply exist without performing. Without having to create laughter to be accepted, she was the support for his heart. The place where he could find balance between joy and pain, between fame and the feeling of being seen. In the following years, this relationship was not only romantic love, but also a place that nurtured creativity. Mel knew there was someone always by his side, witnessing and understanding everything he did, which helped him dare to experiment with bolder jokes, shocking scripts, quirky characters, and turn them into classic works that the whole world would remember. The laughter he created now was no longer only a survival mechanism, but also a way to share pain, a way to connect with audiences, while behind the scenes, Anne was the one keeping him steady, reminding him that he was not alone in this vast world. Thanks to her presence and quiet love, Mel found the ability to expand creative boundaries without fear of collapse, to break every norm, to dare joke about the most terrible things, and at the same time still keep the sensitive heart of a child once abandoned. She saw the fear, saw the loneliness, and simply stayed there, without judging, without demanding, creating a space where Mel could be himself. This love became a long-lasting support, helping him step through the peak years of his career without being overly dominated by the fear of losing laughter or being forgotten. And at the same time became the place where he learned that sometimes recognition and joy did not only come from audiences, but from one person who truly understood him, loved him with all the truth, despite all the laughter or stage lights. And thanks to that, Mel Brooks was able to turn his entire life, from the days of loneliness and poverty to the glorious moments of his career, into a journey both tragic and grand, with love as the only support helping him hold himself steady. Mel Brooks, when stepping into the early years of his marriage with Anne Bancroft, finally felt a sense of peace that he had never experienced throughout the years full of loneliness and insecurity. Family life rarely brought him stability amid a Hollywood that was always noisy, competitive, and full of pressure, where most relationships quickly fell apart. Yet Mel was lucky enough to find a life partner who understood and walked beside him. Those years, Mel lived in a house filled with laughter, but it was simple laughter, not because he was performing or joking on stage, but the laughter of family, of warm dinners, of simple stories, of children running and playing around the house, and sometimes long conversations in the living room. For the first time in his life, he felt that he could relax, that he did not always have to maintain the humorous image to be seen or loved. Within the family circle, he was allowed to be himself, allowed to express his fears, his loneliness, and the quiet insecurities that before only laughter could hide. That peace, though brief and rare, helped him realize that true happiness was not success on screen or resounding laughter from audiences, but the simple moments, being loved by family, being seen and cherished. But even in those peaceful days, fear was always present, quietly seeping in. Fear of losing his life partner, fear of losing his family, fear that at any moment that safety could vanish, like everything else he had tasted in life. This fear did not diminish the value of joy, but added depth to the experience. Mel learned that happiness for him was always fragile, and because it was fragile, it was more precious than ever. Every hug, every smile from Anne, every understanding glance became a mental anchor, helping him continue facing the pressure and insecurity outside, while creating a foundation for him to dare try his hand at later works without complete fear. These peaceful years, though rare, also became a mirror for him to understand that stability, love, and understanding could turn into creative energy, helping him turn fear into jokes, pressure into scripts, and his own life that was both tragic and humorous into inspiration for the whole world. In every meal, every conversation, every exchanged glance, Mel Brooks learned that happiness was never something taken for granted, and precisely because of that fragility, every peaceful moment became precious, making him cherish every laugh, every gentle touch, every simple word from family, and from there, he continued to step out into the world, continued creating, continued making audiences laugh, but this time with a deep understanding that laughter was not only a weapon to protect himself, but also a bridge to spread the rare happiness of family to the world, and for him to survive, to be seen, and to be loved in every circumstance. Mel Brooks stood before one of the most painful moments in his life when Anne Bancroft, his life partner, the only one who understood the real person behind the comedy mask he had worn for 7 decades, passed away in 2005. Her death was not only the loss of a life partner, but the loss of the only refuge, the place where he could remove the mask, cry, laugh, fail, and exist as his true self, without needing to joke, without needing to make others laugh to be accepted. When the hospital room door closed after the final moment, Mel felt an endless void invading his entire soul. A profound absence deeper than any loneliness he had ever experienced since Brooklyn, since the days of being overlooked and invisible. The laughter ringing in his head, the jokes, the scripts that the whole world loved, now no longer brought mental safety. They still existed, but the meaning he had once placed in them, the survival, the recognition, the feeling of being understood, suddenly became empty, like a hollow shell no longer holding the little boy inside. He walked through the room, looked at familiar objects, the mementos Anne had left, but nothing could fill the void her departure created. This was the first time Mel felt that even if the whole world laughed, even if he continued to create jokes or build classic humorous characters, the pain of losing the only one who understood the reason for his existence remained intact, and no one could soothe or compensate for it. In the days after Anne's death, Mel moved slowly through each room, listened to the wind outside the window, breathed in the air full of sounds and memories, and realized that the deepest fear he had carried for so long, the fear of losing his mental refuge, of losing the person who understood him most, had become a vivid and undeniable reality. His laughter, once a survival mechanism, once a shield against loneliness and fear from childhood, now remained only a hollow echo, no longer bringing safety, no longer bringing the feeling of being seen, understood, and accepted. Every time he sat down to write a script, came up with a new scene, or read a humorous line, he felt a simmering absence, reminding him that loneliness now was not only a psychological state, but had become a real part of his life, a part of the void that Anne had once filled. Mel realized that although he had once taught the whole world to laugh, once used laughter to overcome pain, now that loss had proven that nothing could replace the one person who understood the reason for his existence, the one who understood why he had to laugh, why he had to turn pain into jokes, why that lonely Brooklyn boy still continued to survive in a world full of challenges. In the quiet days after the event, Mel often sat alone, looking out at the garden, listening to familiar sounds that now became strange, and every gust of wind, every falling leaf, evoked the void she had left. Laughter still rang out from plays, films, and audiences, but for Mel, it was no longer a means to feel safe. It was no longer proof of his existence, but only an empty echo of a time that had passed, where the only person who truly understood him was no longer by his side. This moment became the peak of the quiet pains Mel had carried since he was little. Loneliness, abandonment, insecurity, now combined with the loss of the most important person, making him clearly feel that no matter how many jokes he created, how many characters he built, and how much he made the whole world laugh, no one could fill the mental void that Anne had once been. Mel Brooks realized that this very loss would follow him for the rest of his life, reminding him that laughter, no matter how powerful, could not replace the deep understanding, empathy, and unconditional love that only one person could bring. In the pain and silence after Anne's death, he gradually realized that every effort in his life, every laugh on stage or in films, had meaning, but the greatest meaning no longer had a refuge to return to. And from there, Mel Brooks stepped into the next phase of his life with a deep understanding that losing the only person who understood the reason for his existence was the greatest challenge, the most profound event, and the pain that no laughter could completely soothe. Mel Brooks stepped into his later years when the stage lights were no longer as bright as before, and his colleagues, friends, and those who had walked with him during the glorious phases of Hollywood passed away one by one, leaving a void that nothing could fill. Hollywood, where he had once conquered with bold imagination and extraordinary laughter, now felt unfamiliar. The rules, the audiences, the storytelling styles had all changed, and what had once been a solid foundation for his creativity now remained only like faint memories. He became the one left behind, the last witness of an era that he had helped define, and this feeling of loneliness was not loud, not dramatic, but lingered persistently like the evening shadow falling over the old streets of Brooklyn, like the sigh of a golden age that no one remembered anymore. In these days, Mel walked along familiar roads, looked at old buildings, listened to the wind whistling through the cracks in the doors, and realized that he had outlived most of the people who had once shared with him the passion, who had once created unforgettable moments on screen and stage. It was not that he had lost everything. His films, his scripts, the laughter of audiences still existed, and his name still echoed. But he had outlived them all, and this very survival brought a feeling that was both cherished and lonely. Mel realized that the loneliness of old age was not because of lacking material things or achievements, but because everyone around him had moved on, leaving him alone with memories, with the laughter he had once created, and with a part of his soul that was always sensitive to emptiness. Each passing day, he clearly felt that he was the last witness of an era that now existed only in the memory of those who had once seen it, and that the creative moments, the laughter ringing on screen or in theaters, now became proof of a long life, but no longer accompanied anyone. The loneliness stretched on, not loud but profound, making him find ways to adapt. Mel still wrote scripts, still told stories, still created characters, but now he did it for himself, for the existence of laughter in memory, not to prove himself to anyone else. He realized that old age was the greatest challenge, not about health, but about the ability to accept that the world had moved on without him, and that all the glory, all the laughter he had once created, remained only like traces that he had to embrace alone. Outliving everyone was not pure joy. It was the vast experience of a loneliness that laughter or success could not soothe, the feeling of watching the world change while he himself stayed the same, the awareness that every creative moment, every play, every film became a reminder that he still existed, still lived, but had become the last witness of a bygone era. In that scene, Mel Brooks learned to accept quiet loneliness, to find value in continuing to create, to let laughter exist even when only silence remained around him. He understood that it was not losing everything that made one lonely, but outliving everyone. And this very survival, although full of solitude, became proof of mental strength, resilience, and the ability to turn loneliness, fear, and loss into endless inspiration, so that even in his final years, Mel remained the keeper of the creative flame, remained the legend who made the world laugh and remember, even though the rest of the world had moved on, changed, and continued without him by its side. Mel Brooks, at 99, sat in his familiar house with soft light shining through the windows, looking back over his entire life that spanned more than 7 decades, and finally admitted the truths he had hidden for so many years. The fear of being forgotten had never left him, the fear that one day the world would fall silent, and the laughter he had once created would remain only as an empty echo. Mel understood that even when the whole world still laughed at his witty jokes, his classic scripts, or the quirky characters he created, That laughter did not always come from joy, but sometimes it was a defense mechanism, a weapon to face the losses, loneliness, and fears that only he truly understood. He remembered the years of poor Brooklyn, the war days, the years living in Hollywood where no one noticed him, and realized that those very experiences had created the shell of humor he had worn all his life, a shell that both shielded and helped him survive. But now, looking back, Mel Brooks understood that his real legacy was not only in his films, his classic comedies, or prestigious awards, but also in the way he had helped others face their own pain. Millions of audiences, lonely people, children once forgotten, adults struggling with life, they had found salvation, comfort, and a reason to continue thanks to the laughter Mel brought. Every funny scene, every quirky character, every absurd situation he built carried a silent message. Even in the most desperate moments, there was still a way to stand up, to overcome, and to keep existing. Mel remembered the first moment when audiences laughed, when he first felt his existence, and realized that every step, every creative effort after that had been guided by a greater purpose. Not to become a legend, not to gain fame or money, but to create moments of mental salvation, to show the world that pain could be mocked, could be turned into laughter, and by doing so, people could stand firm. The deepest losses in his life, from lacking a father, going through poverty and loneliness, to losing Bancroft, all became material for Mel Brooks to create an unusual kind of comedy, both funny and sharp, both profound and humane. He realized that it was precisely the fear, the pain, and the loneliness that had given him the ability to look deeply into human psychology, to understand the fears of audiences, and from there to create moments that not only made people laugh, but also helped them overcome their own darkness. At 99, Mel no longer ran from pain, no longer hid his loneliness or fear. Instead, he turned all of it into laughter. The laughter that both saved him and saved millions of others. That was proof of intelligence, creativity, and the ability to turn suffering into art. In the end, he realized that the greatest legacy was not in awards or fame, but in the way his life had touched and changed other lives. Those who found comfort, connection, and strength to move forward simply because of the laughter Mel Brooks had created. Those smiles, from small theaters to big screens, were proof of the ability to turn pain into joy, fear into strength, and a life full of challenges, losses, and loneliness into a grand journey where both he and the audiences found salvation in seemingly simple, humorous moments. And this was the final truth that Mel Brooks, at 99, looked straight at himself and the world. He did not run from pain, he did not hide from fear, but he had turned all of it into laughter, to survive, to exist, and to show the whole world that even in darkness, people could still find light, and that light, the smile, was the thing that lasted the longest, outlasting every loss, every loneliness, and every fear he had ever experienced. The story of Mel Brooks is a journey both tragic and full of mental glory, where laughter was not only an entertainment tool, but a means of survival, a shield protecting a person from deep wounds since childhood. From the days of being abandoned in Brooklyn, when his father passed away too soon and his mother had to shoulder raising 4 children in poverty, Mel had learned to observe, to exist, and to turn loneliness into creative energy. The moment when audiences first laughed at his joke was not only an artistic turning point, but also proof that the boy who had once been invisible was now seen, recognized, and existed in the vast world. The years of grueling labor, continuous rejection in the entertainment industry, and living in extreme loneliness showed that success did not heal fear. The fear of being forgotten still clung to him, and it was precisely that fear that drove him to keep creating, to keep standing on stage, and to turn suffering into laughter. The greatest tragedy in his life Losing Anne Bancroft, the only one who truly understood the real person behind the mask of humor, further deepened the lesson that it was not laughter or fame that defined a person's value, but connection, love, and understanding. From this story, Americans can draw the lesson that in life, pain, failure, and loneliness are unavoidable, but the way we face them, turn pain into positive energy, and use it to help others, is exactly the proof of real human strength. Mel Brooks teaches that laughter can save both oneself and others, that even in darkness people can still create light, and that the most precious legacy is not in fame or awards, but in the way we touch and change the lives of those around us. If you feel that the story of Mel Brooks has touched your heart, and you want to explore the next moments in the life of this legend, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next part of the video. Thank you for walking with us. See you again in the next video to continue following his emotional and laughter-filled journey.